Now, my role really is to also introduce our important people on the panel. And Dr. Dean, who will join us shortly from Sydney, is on standby, if I may. Dr. Dean was an expert consultant on the UNESCO Quality Physical Education Guidelines for the policymakers, and is the current co-chair of the UNESCO 4th Worldwide Survey on Physical Education. He is also an individual specialist on health and physical education for UNESCO, International Bureau of Education, and Health and Physical Being, an affiliate specialist and scientist in the Infant and Child Health Laboratory at the University of Toronto. Dean's research investigates knowledge at the nexus of education and health. He promotes interventions that yield high-quality learning and health outcomes that are informed by health and physical literacy philosophies.
Okay, so I've been asked to speak a little bit on the quality physical education agenda that's occurring globally at the moment, but also more broadly, more specifically about some of the work that can and will be going on in the Pacific. So, as most of you would realise, UNESCO released its guidelines, or its quality physical education guidelines for policymakers back in 2015. At approximately the same time, the International Charter, the International Charter of Physical Activity, Sport, Physical Education released. So we've had two significant international policy pushes that are both advocating for a quality physical education to be picked up by nation states. So I just want to talk very briefly in the guidelines. If you take the time to read it, what you'll find there are probably four themes that that you can extract that would suggest both the impetus of quality physical education, but also then need to shape the policy and curriculum that support it. So I'm going to talk about one in extensive detail because it has more of a reach than just physical education alone. And one of the big things that comes out of the guidelines is that of physical literacy, which isn't something that is taught as a curriculum. It's a much broader, encompassing philosophy that we can use to inform not only education, but we can use to inform sport, recreation, aspects of our societies as well. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail later. One of the other significant themes that come through in the guidelines shaping our policy thought are around inclusivity. The third one is civic engagement, and the fourth one is around health. So essentially how we promote health. Now when those guidelines were constructed, we were still working under the millennial goals. We've since shifted policy to look at how we all now start to speak to the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030. So when, and there are a number of people in the room I recognise, when we sat down and ratified the Kazan Action Plan a couple of years ago now, is that quality physical education and active schools is only mentioned in one very small part of the plan. But what it says is actually quite profound. It makes a statement that quality physical education needs to be frequent, inclusive, varied, and challenging and meaningful. What myself and a number of colleagues have done is we've just recently published the evidence, the empirical evidence that supports those statements, and why this is important that we start to shape any curriculum design in our countries to ensure that, one, that physical education is a frequent occurrence in schools and it isn't pushed to the margins of curriculum. Now, that's probably easy for people in this room to say, but what we don't quite often look at is the evidence that suggests that nations that run or increase the frequency of the PE delivered in their program are the spin-off effects that it have in terms of broader student learning. Cognitive learning increases by a small effect, which is always a nice feed-in. It doesn't go backwards, so allocating time to PE doesn't mean students will lose learning ground in other areas. The most significant aspects of frequent PE are that students become more engaged in learning more broadly and attending school, and obviously their psychomotor development, as we would hope, increases substantially. So from a multidisciplinary perspective on learning achievement, frequency is going to be something that we need to advocate and instill into our policy documents. And that can be up to daily PE, by the way. We know that inclusive PE is more than just a philosophy. We know that having more inclusive aspects of PE, meeting kids where they are and making sure there aren't ways in which they're excluded, actually has a normalising effect, not just on the people who may be suffering from a disability or an impairment. It actually has a normalising effect on their able-bodied peers. So the importance for inclusive PE can't be underestimated. One other thing I do want to talk about is the varied nature of it. We need to ensure that our PE programs are not becoming early identifiers, sports specialisation programs. We know this is counterintuitive to, one, promoting physical activity across a life course. We also know that specialised programs in the early years, anything before late adolescence, actually has a detrimental effect on long-term athlete ability. So we really want to ensure that QPE is very varied in nature. The next initiative I want to talk about is, as it was mentioned in the introduction, I'm the co-chair of the 4th Worldwide Survey on Physical Education in Active Schools. This is an initiative been led by UNESCO, but at the moment we're negotiating with the Commonwealth Secretariat quite heavily because they've been charged to report on how sport, physical activity are delivering against the full scope of the Sustainable Development Goals. The survey is one of the critical instruments that we'll be rolling out as of next year to report on SDG 4 around quality physical education. So we're in the development phase of that with a scientific committee. The plan is as of next year, there will be a ministerial level survey that will be circulated to all member states, followed up with about 18 months later with a random sampling of schools within participating nations. So I'd really encourage the members in this room to support this survey. It's going to be very important for informing not only worldwide policy in this space, but more importantly, the policies and curriculum and evidence we're using to inform our own decisions within our member states. WHO also have a vested interest in this survey. You'll hear a little bit about the Global Action Plan on Physical Activity, and WHO, obviously, the one area that they're struggling to collect really meaningful data from in terms of physical activity is what's occurring in our schools. So the survey that I spoke about for the first time will be more encompassing than just physical education. It will try and capture physical activity and sporting opportunities afforded to youth beyond the curriculum. So, what progress are we making in the Pacific? Well, as recently as a couple of months ago, we've started developing the very first physical education major within the teacher education program at USP. So myself and a number of stakeholders from across the Pacific, which USP were kind enough to host, we've managed to discuss what are the quintessential elements that we can build into a teacher training program that would provide them with our teachers in the Pacific with the unique skills to deliver on quality physical education in that region. So some of the 8 units, I'm going to talk you through them very quickly, is the big I'm really excited about is this, having a unit of study around Pacific Island movement culture, where we really get to celebrate and investigate the unique movement experiences, dances, games that Pacific people participate in. And there's even you from USP turn that into a MOOC, which is a massive open online course, so we can share and celebrate and recruit students from around the world to learn what movement culture looks like in the Pacific. We've rehashed the swimming and our aquatic safety unit, so it incorporates more around the aquatic pursuits that Islander people are likely to perform in. So it's not just about swimming in a 50-metre pool, it's around how we celebrate our livelihood and sustenance in island nations. So lots of other sorts of aquatic activities around canoeing and snorkeling and so forth that also feed into our leisure and recreation and tourist sectors. There's a whole unit on outdoor education and leisure. There's a unit on health, wellness and fitness, which will explore specifically this notion of physical literacy, which I'm going to come back to, but is an underlying premise of the quality physical education guidelines. We've got a dedicated unit on sport education and coaching, and with our friends at ONOC in the room, ONOC have a program that I've had a brief opportunity to review, the Oceania Sport Education Program, which I think with some very minor modifications is the ability to cross-credential our graduates out of this program so they could be recognised by ONOC as being part of that program, and we'll get some spillage, which would be great, out of the school sectors into our community sport and into our coaching programs and into our community. There's a whole unit dedicated to game-centred and student-centred pedagogy around teaching games for understanding, a whole unit around inclusive movement performance, although that theme will be threaded through all the units. There's a dedicated unit to teaching teachers to be more inclusive in their practice. And another quintessential one is this teaching physical education in the Pacific, which is really around equipping teachers to teach with minimal resources, minimum time, minimum space even in some regards, to what the authentic teaching looks like in the Pacific. Now, the timeline on that program is to roll it out in 2021 with our first graduates, or with our first students enrolling in that program as a major in 2021. Final thing I want to talk about is this notion of physical literacy. Those of you who haven't come across it, I've provided a number of readings in your handout and links, and I'm happy for you to reach out to me in person. But some fabulous news is, since this was launched in the QP guidelines, this pursuit of how people learn through their bodies, the important learning that people undertake, both socially, cognitive, physically, and motivationally, learn to be active across their life course is really is growing exponentially in the empirical research. So much so, just from an international perspective, some of you might be aware, myself and two other researchers here in Australia recently released the Sport Australia Physical Literacy Framework. This framework has been under development for about 3 years now, and we've seen it gain massive traction, some certain different iterations across the world, and working with a number of partners in their own interpretation. So Sport New Zealand recently picked up the model, and Sport New Zealand have just been testing some tools, some assessment instruments that they can use in school settings, but also in coaching settings, to collect the development of physical literacy in populations of youth. And even more recently, only just last month, the single largest research project out of the European Union in this space, worth about $600,000 Australian, €400,000, was to develop a physical literacy model or physical literacy framework based upon the Australian model for the entire European Union. So what does that mean for us down here? There's an appetite for using physical literacy as a mechanism for change, cooperation, and increased dialogue across sectors. That's the real key that we're finding with it. It's allowing sport to talk to education, to talk to tourist and recreation, to talk back to sport. So it's a really great way to find a common language to get out of our silos and speak to what we've all been advocating for around these multidisciplinary cross-sectorial collaborations. So what we're doing in the Pacific is it's been funded by ONOC and UNESCO and the USP rather, is the establishment of a physical literacy advisory group with the goal to develop a Pacific physical literacy framework in 2020. We've worked really hard to recruit widely and diversely for the membership on that advisory group, with representatives from Polynesia, Melanesia and Micronesia, as well as a delegate from Australia and New Zealand to feed into that group. We're hoping that collaboration of cultures, minds and of intellect will be able to produce a framework similar to what we've been using in these other countries and other states around the world to promote the efficient mobilisation of resources and not just physical resources, but also human resources, so we can really start to deliver on not just SDG 4, but a range of SDGs across the sport, education and recreation sectors. And I think that's my 10 minutes up. I'm happy to take any questions.
Dr. Dean, it's Tino here, sorry. I have one for you. Just to start the ball rolling. In your research, and I know we met a few months ago, what would be some of the challenges that you envisage or anticipate in the Pacific when you're going to carry out this research work in the development space?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. So there's a very strong paradigmatic divide amongst researchers in physical education, and it's been this way for about 40 years. So on one end of the spectrum, we have a lot of people who are interested in social critical discourse and are basically problematizing any information, health data, anything that seeks to, and rightly so. I mean, it is a problematic area, but it's not particularly helpful in policy design because it's very centric to the individual. Conversely, there is a large, with the growing rates of NCDs in number of populations, there's a growing push in the public health sector for much more clinical studies, and sometimes that can miss the nuance of learning, which is what I would like us all to focus on when we talk about physical education. Because if you focus on the research that is driven by how it promotes learning about people's health, how an individual learns about their health, how they learn about their physicality, we know when we follow that trend that those people end up living more healthy, sustainable lives anyway. So the real friction is going to come across when we come competing agendas. This is why I would really hope that this physical literacy group and this physical literacy agenda is starting to smooth some of the way between those conflicting parties, because people do have an ability to speak to at the table, regardless of their paradigm. In the research, what they are interested in is the well-being of the individual. And if we can get the words and we can get the framework right, hopefully it becomes a really collective space where the public health agenda is front and centre, but it's right there with how it empowers schools, how it empowers curriculum, how it empowers teachers to deliver on those outcomes.
Could you just share with us, because here in Fiji, I'm talking on behalf of the Pacific, we need to have clear guidelines of the policies to follow so that we can make PE and health, more challenging. If you can just elaborate more on that. When we talk about policy, what sort of policy guidelines do you have? Perhaps you can share that with us. That will be a learning experience for us. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Obviously, using the UNESCO guidelines is a good place to start. And Fiji was a case study along with Canada. There were a couple of other countries. So I know there's a report coming up on some countries that we can draw on about their policy guidelines. More specifically, I think that there is I don't think it's in the best interests of countries to simply use an existing nation state's curricula or policy and transplant it across. I think for these things to work really well, they need to be co-constructed with the stakeholders. Otherwise, if you don't have that ownership of the people who need to enact the curriculum, those people vested in the curriculum, it just becomes an empty document. So one of the things that I would suggest is bringing those stakeholders together and talk about what are the quintessential, what are the important learning outcomes that you want your children and your youth to achieve in physical education for the term in which they're going to be studying there, and then be really realistic about what can and can't be achieved. Start idealistic and then work back to defendable learning outcomes that teachers and parents can see in terms of behaviour change as kids develop and youth develop, and use that and then build a policy that protects those learning outcomes. If you simply try and pick up the curriculum structure of other countries and transplant it, and I've seen this happen a number of times, it inevitably fails. So I know that in terms of human resources across the Pacific, they're limited. So there are probably some good opportunities, given the similarities in culture and people and values, to collaborate on this. I think working with USP, given that it's going to have a teacher education program with a physical education specialty that can be delivered across the Pacific, regardless of the nation or the member state that's rolling it out, especially in that last unit around teaching in the Pacific, it would be really, really pertinent to have each of the member states have some stake in that unit and what they would expect a teacher coming into their communities to be able to achieve. In my mind, policy really needs to be the safeguard that none of that hard work around what we want students to achieve and how we want them to develop is undermined by a flimsy policy document.
Right next to Ala Ferretti is Dr. Awe Ta'ava, joining us from the Cook Islands, who has a PhD in traditional games and physical education. And I think one of the examples you just gave there, Dean, about transplanting a curriculum from another country, that was the experience in Cook Islands, taking New Zealand's physical education curriculum, but then that changed. Perhaps Dr. Ta'awa can speak to that.
I know in the Pacific we don't have a human anatomy. Probably we don't know a lot about the literacy, about the muscles and the physiology in our own language. I don't know here in Fiji, but in the Cook Islands, we tend to be influenced by the literacy of critical theories that comes from Australia or New Zealand or abroad. But in getting into understanding the literacy from a cultural context, is we can draw on our traditional sports and games, because our elders probably know what are those terminologies that are used in sports and exercise science. And in looking at literacy, it's still an area that needs to be developed in the Pacific. And it's an area that needs to be explored. And by hoping to work through the stakeholders and get this health and physical education, courses approved at USP, could be a possibility of collaborating with other Pacific Island nations in coming up with a theory around what does physical education literacy should look like in the Pacific nations. So from my perspective, Dean, I think it's an area that needs to be researched, an area that needs to be developed. And hopefully we can draw on those experiences that you have and actually translate that into a Pacific Island literacy and numeracy. Because I don't know about other Pacific Islanders in this room, but I don't know from a Cook Island context, we've lost a lot of our languages. We don't have a word for some of human anatomy or what's the word? Trapeziums or things like that. So it's something that we lack in understanding those concepts and the meanings of those, what that means in a cultural context. Okay, Dean. over to you. So, Dean, the question I'm going to ask is, with your knowledge and experience in the area, how could you come more often in the Pacific and train us how to collaborate more in the area of physical literacy? Because I know I'm not familiar with physical literacy, but it's an area that needs to be explored.
It's a really good question, Ale, because there's a danger that that we think that if we develop a program in one of the universities and we roll it out, that we've done our job and we wipe our hands of it. You need to think of in order for this change to occur and to evolve and grow over time, you need to think of it in the same way. It's not a vaccine, it's a flu shot. So it's not something you give to teachers one-off. They graduate and they're fully developed and they're going to carry this beam for you. You've got to think of it as almost like an annual inoculation. And what I mean by that is you're going to have to put in professional development programs, professional learning opportunities for teachers that they can do on a regular basis, whether it be annually or even biannually, so they can keep that conversation, so they can stay connected to the knowledge that you're generating in the university, but they can also stay connected to the context. One of the things that we always found the physical literacy frameworks fall over is when you try and apply them universally. The only time they work is when you take them and you experiment with them in a particular context, not just a cultural context, but the movement context itself, whether you're exploring dance or games or aquatics or gymnastics, doesn't really matter. But the important thing is that you can have a broad understanding and a universal understanding of what learning through movement looks like without all the jargon that you're talking about, so people don't get buried in anatomy and physiology language. And you can break it down to simply being able to describe how behaviour changes over time when they're exposed to quality physical education programs or programs in the community. To get your teachers to do that, you have to invest in them beyond just graduation. You have to have programs just like a flu shot that they can get every year regularly that keeps them in the game, that keeps them thinking about what's happening. Because quite often what you'll see is that policy, legislation and curriculum can change being informed by the best evidence, but that can take almost a generation of teacher change to be effective, and you don't want that because you'll spend the rest of your life playing catch up. So I would say invest heavily in professional learning programs, invest heavily in as soon as teachers are graduating and how they stay connected with not just those teachers, but future graduating teachers and their academics. And more importantly, how you build in the policymakers and the bureaucrats into that model that maintain that conversation.
That's a perfect lead into my next question, which is, given that we're in the room today with such a diverse set of stakeholders, and we have an education minister from Vanuatu, we have a sports minister from Palau, we have a permanent secretary for youth and sports, and my question is, what are your perspectives on how we connect the dots between sport policy and education policy, particularly for physical education at the national level? What does that mean for ministers, and what does that mean for permanent secretaries and senior officials? Sorry, Dean, that's a question for the ministers. Yep, sorry.
Well, thank you very much. I think we need to speak to get and talk together. We need to make sure that we embrace a kind of a collective approach to policy formulation when we talk about sports. It's only about the three ministries. I mentioned in my opening remarks this morning, sports involves more entities, more institutions than the Ministry of Sports, Youth and Sports, and the three ministries present here. So I think the onus and the challenge is on us now to try and embrace a kind of a collective or holistic approach and making sure that we when formulating, sports development policies with it, I expect that there should be consultations between all the relevant ministries and institutions on how we can all, build into making sure that we develop policies that are comprehensive to favor the development of sports rather than running parallel kind of policies and with no point of convergence. Sports development is more like less like it's a cross-cutting issue, and when we think about it, more seriously, we need to be talking more, opening up the discussions between us, ministries in the government, but also as our own forum is trying to advocate, making sure that we reflect it as a substance that is owned by many other stakeholders than the ministries in government, including obviously civil society, including the private sector when it comes to organizing competitions and whatnot. So I think this is where we need to put more thoughts on how we build our policy framework. That's the way I see it. Thank you. Colleague.
I echo the same comment from our minister from Vanuatu, but I think it's also important there's, in the context of the Pacific Island region, I think it's important to look at also what are policies that are similar to capitalize on the physical activity and physical education in terms of health, education, and then harnessing from those policy development, or if not, then the research aspect of it. So I think, as I mentioned this morning, it's really important to look around what sport can contribute to, because we have agreed that sports can contribute to some change in our community in terms of health improvement and our goal to achieve some of our sustainable development goals in certain areas. So we need to capitalize on those areas and maybe even leverage the contribution of sport in the physical activity and physical education into some of our existing data or analysis to our statistics office, particularly with the Ministry of Finance in terms of the upcoming surveys, census surveys, or household income expenditures. We can capitalize on those things. But I think it's also very important for us to see what we have on the ground and then capitalize on those opportunities that we, sports leaders and also researchers, can work together to contribute in that mainstream. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Dean, for your presentation and offering. We appreciate your time, and you'll certainly hear from us very soon.
For Naka.
Naka.